Hello, welcome to this evening's virtual event with Brookline Booksmith, featuring Frances Moore Lappé for her book Diet for a Small Planet in conversation with Raj Patel. My name is Bonnie, and I'm a bookseller at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Massachusetts. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. It's great to have you once again. If this is your first time at an event with us, welcome. We're so happy to have everyone join our community tonight. We so appreciate your support of Frances and Raj and the book and an independent bookstore through your purchases and attendance. I would love to tell you a little bit about Anna Lappé, who is joining us tonight to introduce our authors. In addition to being Frances's daughter, Anna is a co-founder and strategic advisor at Real Food Media and the Food Sovereignty Fund director at the Pantareya Foundation. She is the author of Diet for a Hot Planet, which you can peek in the back of her background there. And she is also the contributor to the 50th anniversary edition of Diet for a Small Planet, helping curate the book's recipe section with fully refreshed and updated recipes. And I will hand it off to Anna for introductions.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, Bonnie, and welcome everybody. And unfortunately, my internet's been a little bit glitchy, so hopefully I won't glitch out and like freeze in a really embarrassing expression. But it's really so heartwarming to see so many familiar names in the chat, friends, long held friends from all around the world. So welcome all of you friends, new and old. And it is really my honor to be introducing my mother and Raj tonight. As Bonnie said, I'm Anna Lappé, and yes, daughter of Frances Moore Lappé. And I'll be just doing quick introductions for my mom and for Raj. It was really one of the great joys of my life to help my mom on this 50th anniversary edition of this book. Some of you may have some, dog-eared copies of the original from 50 years ago, to transform it into this book, which you'll hear much more about tonight. As I think many of you tuning in might also feel, it feels like Diet for a Small Planet and its updated and visionary new message has never felt more urgent. I want to give a huge special thanks to Raj for joining us this evening, for the folks at Brookline Booksmith for helping with this event. Also really want to give a huge shout out to the recipe developer and nutritionist we worked with, Wendy Lopez from Food Heaven Made Easy. She is amazing, and really had such a fun time working with her. And I want to thank Amy Mazzara for these wonderful illustrations in the book. Paige Green did the incredibly beautiful photography, working with farms in Northern California to capture the beautiful food. I want to thank all of our Diet for a Small Planet fans who've been such incredible support over the years. Thank you all for tuning in and sharing your love and support. I'd also like to thank two advocacy organizations that have been really supporting us in huge ways: Friends of the Earth and a new organization called Default Veg. You can also go to our website, dietforasmallplanet.org, and see many of the organizations that we work with, working all around the world on related issues. So my little introductions for my mom and Raj, who probably need no introduction for many of you. But for those of you who don't know, Frances Moore Lappé, also sometimes known as Frankie, and to Three Humans as Grammy, is the author or co-author of 20 books about world hunger, democracy, and the environment, beginning with Diet for a Small Planet. She is the co-founder of 3 national organizations, including Food First and the Small Planet Institute. She has been awarded 19 honorary degrees, soon to be 20. So for those of you counting, she's keeping track, books, honorary degrees, keeping them matched there. And I'll sort of close her introduction with a quote, one of my favorite quotes about her, from Howard Zinn, who probably many of you know. He was the author of A People's History of the United States. And he said, and I'll try to read this without tearing up: "A small number of people in every generation are forerunners in thought, action, and spirit, who swerve past the barriers of greed and power to hold a torch high for the rest of us. Lappé is one of those." Okay, I teared up a little bit, but I'll put the quote in the chat. I love it. So that's a little bit about my mom. For those of you who don't know, Raj also probably doesn't need an introduction. For many of you, Raj Patel is an award-winning author, filmmaker, and academic. He's a research professor in the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas and has degrees from the University of Oxford, London School of Economics, Cornell University, very fancy. And in one of my favorite lines ever in a bio, he writes that he has worked for the World Bank and the World Trade Organization and protested against both around the world. I highly recommend all of his books, and especially his latest with Dr. Rupa Marya, called Inflamed, Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice. And I will be dropping some information into the chat, including how you can find that book along with Diet for a Small Planet. He also has his first documentary out called The Ants and the Grasshopper. You can find that online. And for another medium, if that wasn't enough, another medium in which you can absorb Raj's wisdom, you can also hear a podcast that he does called The Secret Ingredient with our friend Tom Philpott at Mother Jones and KUT's Rebecca McEnroy. So with all of that, I'm really delighted to turn it over to Raj and to Mom. They'll be having a conversation. I urge all of you to put any questions you have into the Q&A. I will be tracking those, and then I'll be passing questions over to Raj, and later in the hour, he will open it up to hear from all of you and hear your questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Raj. At the very end, I'll come back to say our goodbyes, but thank you so much, and I'll turn it over to Raj.
Well, thank you so much, Anna. And I have to say, I'm deeply honored both by the invitation to join y'all, but particularly, Frankie, I mean, it's no exaggeration for me to observe that I wouldn't be where I am were it not for your vision, your intellect, your determination, and your courage in seeing the first edition of A Diet for a Small Planet to fruition. I mean, you know, for me, I mean, it's possible in America now to imagine that what you eat is directly related to the world and society around you, and that one can change another in ways, I mean, now it seems obvious, but when you were researching this book, not so much. And so maybe let's start there. Frankie, why did you write the first edition of this? What moved you to take on such a project?
Well, I want to tell a little bio there because it actually started, the origin of the passion started when I was working as part of the Lyndon B. Johnson War on Poverty, right? So there we have a connection. Because it was a time when a lot of people really believed that we could make significant change. And the whole MO was what we called maximum feasible participation. It was what I now call living democracy, the idea that more people would get involved. And so I was in a very poor area in Philadelphia, working as part of a government program that was trying to help really poor people buy their own homes and become, you know, really able to protect themselves against the slumlords that were ruining their lives. But in that work, the woman I worked most closely with, Lily, died of a heart attack. She died of a heart attack in her early 40s, and I was convinced that she died of poverty, the stress of poverty. And Raj, I didn't know how my work, my organizing work was really getting to the roots. But I ended up out in Berkeley because my children's father, wonderful Mark Lappé, and he got a postdoc at Berkeley. And I had time to really ask. You know, I started in an organizing school at Berkeley, but I felt like I just had to go deeper. And the light bulb went on. And I thought, if I could just understand why are people hungry in the world, food is so basic that would unlock the mysteries of economics and politics. And I'd know what to do with my life. And so I just literally went to the basement library, the agriculture library at Berkeley, and I just put two and two together almost literally. And we were living at a time that I still think had its grip on us, and that is the grip of scarcity, focused on quantities, and we don't have enough, and we're in this battle over not enoughness. And the book, Paul and Anne Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, had just exploded, and people were terrified and were saying, oh, I don't know if I should have children. And I had to know, is it true? Have we really run out of Earth's capacity to feed us? And then, wow, I realized, no, we were creating the experience of scarcity out of plenty. And it just turned my world upside down when I realized we were talking about efficiency, and we had this industrial idea of, oh, a fancy modern farm is really efficient. And yet it was vastly grounded in waste, in creating waste. So that's a very long-winded answer to your first question, but it's how it all began. And I love to say, admit, I made a D on my first English paper in college. And so, Raj, I never thought I'd be a writer. But as I tell young people today, if you really have something you've got to say, then you figure out what the words are. And I just had to share this because I felt it was crazy the way the world was telling us. I mean, the experts were telling us that scarcity was the problem. And when we were actually generating scarcity with what I've now come to call this extreme form, a brutal form of capitalism that returns one rule, it's driven by one rule. How do we bring the highest return to people who already have wealth? And so we end up with such concentration, then many can't get the food they need. So thank you for letting me go on.
No, Frank, I mean, I have to say, I'm shocked that you didn't always want to be a writer, because the prose in this book is so beautiful, so readable, so it's infused with an activist clarity. But I guess that explains why, is because you're using the words to serve this other end rather than in the delight of merely stringing a sentence together for the hell of it. But I wonder, I mean, maybe you can talk to us about why it is that this book, written in that time, has had such longevity. I mean, how is it that this book has, in ways that the population bomb really hasn't done so well over time? This book remains always vital and always important. I'm wondering if you can take a guess at the longevity of the book. How is this book so vital across the ages?
Well, first of all, I never anticipated that, of course. I just had to get these ideas out. But I think now I've developed what I call my trilogy of what human needs are. If you'll bear with me. I propose that all of us, our basic needs beyond food, are for a sense of agency, power. We don't want to feel powerless. A sense of meaning in our lives, not just, we have to have meaning, and a sense of connection with others. And if more than that, with the earth itself. So power, meaning, and connection. And I think that that's what I was finding as I was writing, and that's what I wanted to share. And that's why people over all these decades have continued to respond, I think, because we're all looking for that. And, oh, you mean what I eat every day could be a source where I'm not a victim, I'm also have agency, I'm really affecting things beyond myself. And you mean that this has meaning, real deep meaning about the earth and myself and others, and it connects me with others. And so power, meaning, and connection. So I think that it's really that, and that's what appealed to me. And I think that is why it continues to attract, because we all want that.
But I think that's absolutely right. This is a book that it does speak to not only how it is that we can interpret the world around us, but what it is that we might do to change it. But you mentioned when you were writing this book that your goal to the big prize of having to suffer by sitting in the basement and the agricultural library and the tube lights flickering and the smell of the lino floor was that you would, at the end of this, understand what it was that you needed to do with your life. And I want to ask you about that. What this book launched a journey for you. Can you tell us a little bit about that journey and what came after the first edition of this book?
Well, I've tried to weave this path through my life of keeping on asking the question behind the question. And behind the question of food for me always is who makes decisions? Who has the power? And so I've tried to explore, what does democracy mean? Because right now ours is very corrupted compared to other industrial countries, other Western countries. We rank very low, beneath about 50 or 60 other countries in the quality. We also have one of the most extreme concentrations of income and wealth of, over 100 countries. I mean, so who's making those decisions? That's what I've been exploring. And so I've tried then, by the early 90s, I founded an organization called the Center for Living Democracy. Because I didn't want to give up my food and agriculture focus, but I wanted to say, okay, how do we rethink democracy? And I love to quote the first African-American appellate judge, William Hastie, who said, democracy is not being, it is becoming. It is easily lost and never finally won, but its essence is eternal struggle. And we know now with John Lewis' spirit in us that it is the good struggle, it is the good fight. And so that's the spirit that it's a never-ending journey that we do together. And so I wanted to participate in that and help reform that. And then after I moved to Cambridge 20 years ago and founded the Small Planet Institute, we've always tried to align with and to help support, while working still and doing book on world hunger, for example, to help to people to see that there really is a growing democracy movement as well. And that we in the food movement are arm in arm. We have to be with the democracy movement that is fighting the terrible suppression of voting and allowing such great influence of wealth and private interest. Do you know, by the way, one of my little zingers I wanted to throw out tonight, that there are more lobbyists from the ag industry than there are from oil and gas, for example, in Washington today. And so I just wanted always to allow us to see that whatever our specific passion is, that we can understand that we can get to our journey on this food question, say the incredible degradation of our diet in America, as we also align with the democracy movement, because now agribusiness has so much power to degrade our land and degrade our diet. So does that answer your question, Raj?
It does. I mean, I also wanted to just plug for folk that there, among the many other things that Frankie has set up, is an organization that I have a soft spot for called Food First, the Institute for Food and Development Policy. And it was there that I got my first job in America. And I feel like I just owe you a huge debt for having set that up along the way. But I'm also... Yeah, I'm struck by the fact that this is, as you say, a constant struggle, and that we've been hearing recently about how young people today are incredibly anxious and depressed about the state of our world, the state of our democracy, the state of our food system, and the certainty that they will live through many more climate disasters than we ever had to live through. You were 26 when you wrote this book. And I wonder what you might say now to the young people who are feeling the grief of the extinctions that were reported yesterday, and feel the weight of these lobbyists in Washington seeming to capture whatever administration is in their path. I mean, was it always like this?
No, it wasn't always this bad at all. I want to really underscore that. I think it is sort of a tale of two generations, my generation and my children's generation. They were born in the 70s. And I think it's really important to understand that I was born in the mid 40s. And from that time to the 70s, that every income quintile doubled its real family income. And the lowest gained the most, not a lot more than the others, but a little bit more at least. And then in the early 70s, there was a very direct campaign led by the Chamber of Commerce and others that began to twist our minds away from that basic fairness and let the market, the magic of the market that Reagan called it, let it go. And what happened? What happened, if you look at then from the mid 70s on up to through the decades, that wealth just is streaming to the top. So it goes from every income quintile gaining, the doubling of real family income in my generation to my children's generation, where it's just sped to the top. So it's so important that we don't assume that what we have today in this extreme, unfair, and threatening environment is inevitable. It is not inevitable. I mean, I think back to in the 70s, when Jimmy Carter ran for president, he used public financing. And the most current presidential election in the United States cost $14.4 billion. And the Carter years in the 70s, it was, you know, a teeny fraction, you know, a minor fraction of that. So it was a few million. Anyway, it's a tiny fraction. So I just want to underscore that, no, it doesn't have to be this corrupt. And also in terms of, I think you mentioned lobbyists. For example, during the 1970s, there were relatively few lobbyists in Washington. After this turn happened and Reagan said, go, go, go for this one, what I call the one rule market, what brings highest return to existing wealth. That's what kind of market we had, go for that. Then the firms with lobbyists in Washington grew 14-fold over about an 11-year period. So that shouldn't be a given in our society. That happened like that, and that therefore it can be reversed, and it has to be reversed. So that just remembering the spirit of the war on poverty, where we were all felt like we were working toward eliminating poverty. And we did, by the way. Reagan said that the war on poverty, that poverty won. Actually, in about 11 years, we cut the rate of poverty in half. Now, we didn't get there all the way, but in social change, that's pretty quick, you know, deep social change. So I just want to use this opportunity to remind, especially people much younger than I am, that it doesn't have to be this way. And that there are great examples of other countries. I was just looking at the last German election, and it spent, you know, 100 million or something like that compared to our, it came out to a little over $1 per person in Germany versus several $100s per person, like $400 per person in the United States if you took all the money spent in the election. So it's just a world of difference. And we don't really appreciate how out of step we are in terms of the extreme influence of money in our system.
Well, Frankie, actually, that gets me to another sort of follow-up question, which is around who you look to for hope and inspiration. I mean, you wrote in 2002, Hope's Edge with a young Anna Lappé, and you know, you were writing it in the context of an America that was in need of both hope and democracy. And now it's 20, you know, we're almost 20 years after that, and we need those things rather desperately. And you know, one of the hallmarks of this magnificent book is, you know, the breadth of your intellectual curiosity and also your generosity in recognizing where the good ideas are. And although this is called A Diet for a Small Planet, it's never something that you do by yourself. It's always a collective project. So I wonder whether you might be able to share some of the sort of beacons that you've seen that can help us put the United States into its context, just like you did with you know, the German election. I'm wondering if there are other beacons of hope that you might encourage us to turn our heads towards.
Yes, it's so important. I believe hope has power. And actually, the scientists tell us that hope actually organizes our brains towards solutions. So hope is not for wimps, is the way I like to put it. You've got to have energy to take action, and hope will give you that. So it's not nicey nice feel good. It's evidence-based inspiration. And so Anna and I, to write Hope's Edge, one of the things we did was to go visit the landless workers movement in Brazil. And these are people, just to, you know, Brazil, talk about concentration of power. It's like 3% of the landholders control more than, you know, like 70% of the land. It's crazy. And so landless people then, because the Constitution said that land that should serve a social function, they believed that they had the right to go into unused land and just settle on it and start growing food ecologically and feeding themselves and creating viable communities. And it turned into just this incredibly powerful movement when we were there that just was so inspiring to us. And it's continued to build. So that that courage of people who are among the most oppressed on earth to actually coming together and taking that kind of chance and risking their lives and succeeding and continuing to push. And we also, while we were there, we visited a city of 2.5 million people, a significant Brazilian city. And you know what they decided? They decided that they were going to get rid of hunger, zero hunger. And so they did it in a very, they went about it in a very democratic way, where they really brought all sectors of society together, religious groups, farmers of all sizes, business, all different parts of society, and they came up with a plan. And we got to go there and visit and see what they were doing, and just simple things, and not rocket science, right? Like allowing farmers to have farm stands in the poorest area, and having trucks go out into the poorest neighborhoods with affordable produce, and getting kids lunches with really nutritious, some interesting ingredients that the kids would eat, and really super nutritious. And they were able to seriously cut infant mortality and early child death by a significant percent in just a little over, just a little over a decade. And we'll never forget the moment we interviewed the woman in charge, Adriana Arana, as we left Belo Horizonte. I don't know if I even mentioned the name of the city I was talking about, Belo Horizonte in Brazil. And we were so impressed. And we said, Adriana, how did this happen? Oh, we were so impressed. And she said, what upsets me so, and she got kind of teary, is how easy it is to end hunger. And obviously they hadn't ended it completely, but what she was saying was, oh my God, we could have done this so much sooner. It's not, it's not, you bring people together and you just use your common sense. Like they had people's restaurants where you could go in and buy for a very little amount of money, buy a really healthy meal. And so they were working with all elements of society. So that certainly is inspiring. And then can I tell one more story?
No, absolutely.
I visited in India, women there in rural India a few years ago. And they told me that they had been, absolutely everyone in their villages was hungry all the time, 20, 30 years ago. And then just with a little bit of seed money and a little bit of circle of savings where they came together, the women in their women's groups at night after the kids were in bed, they would come together and start plotting and planning how could they make changes in their lives. And what's extraordinary is just with these little saving circles, and they were able to get enough to get a little more land, and they started planting all sorts of crops in the same fields, crops that made them healthier. And they said, now in our 75 villages, there is no hunger. They got a radio station. This is the Deccan Development Society. They got their own radio station so they could tell other people in other villages what they were doing. And now their healthy millets are procured for the school lunches in many of the states that, in that Andhra Pradesh area where they are. And so the end of this story I've got to share is that as I was leaving this village and they were telling me all this, I was walking out and I said my goodbyes, and I heard all this rushing footsteps behind me, and I turned around and they said, Frances, we forgot to tell you the most important thing. And of course I stopped, and they said, the most important thing is courage. Courage we got from our women's group. And that has stayed with me all these years, Raj. And courage, I end the opening chapter of the new Diet for a Small Planet on the theme of courage, because as I think goodness is not good enough anymore in the state we're in, so many threats. Being a good person is the first, being kind and being decent person is very important, but we've got to push ourselves to do that which is scary and makes us uncomfortable. If that means getting out and trying new ideas, new groups, to feel like we're going deeper to the roots of our crises. And so I just loved it when they came out and told me that it was courage that they got from each other. And so I think that I always say to others and myself that if you want to become more courageous, hang out with courage. hang out with courage, people more gutsy than you are.
I mean, that in and of itself, Frankie, is so inspirational. And I know that your work has inspired people across the world. I'm inspired, for example, by people who are inspired by your work. For example, there's a fantastic organization called FIAN, and they were, they're based in Europe, but are active around the world. And I was like, well, what does FIAN stand for? Food First Information and Action Network, drawing on your work, Frankie. And they've been really successful in, moving the needle with policymakers around the world, so that, even in Europe now, the European Union has sort of announced this farm to fork initiative that is going modestly, but still in the right direction to reduce the amount of pesticides on the land and reduce the greenhouse gas footprint. And unfortunately, here in the US, we're laggards. Just a couple of days back, Secretary Vilsack was saying, oh yeah, no, those Europeans are going about this all the wrong way. And what we need to do is partner with our agribusiness friends in the United Arab Emirates and in Brazil, where, 4 out of the top 10 pesticides used there are banned in Europe. And it seems like America's going the wrong direction. And so I'm wondering, while you've inspired so much hope outside the United States, where do you recommend that we seek our hope and our need to find rocket fuel to really seize our democracy back from agribusiness right here in the United States? Where should we start looking for hope and the sort of full...
This highly processed. More people are now really catching on how dangerous our diet is. 60% of the calories that Americans consume now are empty calories. They're just from highly processed foods, and that has led then to a quadrupling of the diabetes rate in the last 25 years or so. It's just enormously damaging. So you asked me to talk about what inspires me, and I've come up with some pretty negative numbers there, but I feel there is an awakening that more people are choosing a more plant-centered diet, more whole foods diet. That's certainly true. Those sales of organic are outdistancing other sales. So I feel like there is definitely much more than ever in my lifetime, an awakening to that this corporate-driven, highly processed diet is incredibly dangerous to our health, and that there is another way that is so rewarding, this plant-centered eating that is a joy to me. It's fun. People used to think, oh, you give up meat and you're losing something. But I thought, oh gosh, when I moved away from meat, that was where all the variety was, all the color and texture and different tastes are in the plant world I discovered. And so I just want to really bring that to light, that this is a journey of discovery and feeling healthier and better as we align with what our bodies really need, and show that we don't need to be dependent on corporate processors with all of the additives that are harming us.
Frankie, I have more questions about that, but since I have the joy of being able to monitor some of the chat and the Q&A, I do want to throw in just a question about meat that comes from Mike Carberry. I apologize if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, Mike. But Mike says that he's been working in sustainable, regenerative and organic ag for a number of years, and he advocates for getting livestock out of CAFOs and industrial factory farms and back on the pasture where they belong. So what are your thoughts about the health effects to people and planet of pasture-raised meat? Is that a way of threading the needle around climate change and moving up? Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll just leave it there.
Well,
I know you asked.
There's still. Let me just say that for everybody on climate change, that that our whole food system contributes 37% of greenhouse gas emissions, and 14.5% of that is from livestock. And one thing that sticks in my head is that somebody calculated that if cows were a country, they would be the 6th largest greenhouse gas emitter. And they have this very potent methane emission that is multiple times the problem of carbon emissions. So I don't think there's any way we can get there on a health footing or climate change footing and continue to have livestock anywhere near the degree that we have. If we were to convert to pasture cattle, then we would eat what we are today. And I think that would be a very good thing, but we would still, I've seen there's a debate, and I've seen that debate in the scientific literature about actually that grass-fed is still very much a climate problem. So I just want to underscore that that overall, reducing our intake of grain-fed meat is extremely important. And I just learned, I don't know, maybe you knew this, Lars, but I just learned last week that processed meat, which is 20% of our overall meat consumption, is deemed a probable carcinogen by the World Health Organization. And I just found that so interesting, that something that people consume every day, and they're not being told that the WHO has made that judgment. So that just quite alarming, and that red meat itself is a problem for increasing our risk of cancers. So I don't remember what your question was.
No, that was it. I mean, I think it's, what you said is that, in response to the idea of switching from CAFOs to pasture raised, pasture raised is better than CAFOs, but pasture raised isn't enough. If we are going to have a sustainable agriculture system, then I mean, I've seen the data around this and agree that perhaps there's room for some livestock, and particularly in the global south, there are sustainable livestock approaches, but nothing like what we've got in the United States at the moment, it seems to me. So. But I wonder also if we can talk about the land beneath our feet, because again this is something that's sort of propping up in the chat, is around the food movement itself has in some ways picked up the taint of the sort of Berkeley aristocracy, and there are racial configurations and class configurations that come along with that, and you've long railed against that, and I'm wondering if you can talk to us about some of the ideas that you've encountered around how to address the deep racial injustice that persists in America's food system, and not just in terms of consumption, but also in terms of who owns the land. I mean, particularly when we know that Bill Gates is now the largest farmer in the United States, and that 50% of farms aren't owned by the people who are operating them, and that number's going up because farmland is this vast sort of parking lot for immense wealth. How do we start to have to see the kinds of transformations that every democracy needs that involves reparation and racial justice, particularly in this country?
Well, absolutely. I know there has been a significant push for a reparations approach, because I have the figure in the book and I've forgotten exactly, but I mean, it's extraordinary loss of farmland by Black owners. I mean, it just went from very significant to virtually nothing. And so that needs to be part of any kind of social justice legislation that we pursue, where we begin to make reparations for that. And one leading light who I love to call out, who I do in the book, is the Soulflower Farm, Leah Penniman in upstate New York, who has just brilliantly created an opportunity for African Americans to learn and to draw on their African heritage. She tells the story that her great-grandmother, one of her ancient line, actually wove seeds into her hair as she was going to be taken away on the slave ship to America. And so she brought these seeds. And so they feel at Soulflower Farm that they are continuing to build on their own traditions. And so I think any way we can support and multiply that kind of opportunity. And then there are, other organizations that are working to help to rectify this incredible loss of land ownership by African Americans. So I think that the beauty of the food question and the agriculture question, that it touches on everything, the most personal, our health, and this question of basic fairness and correcting historic injustice, all of that. And I'm really glad that you brought up that challenge.
Well, and maybe more broadly, Frankie, we could talk about some of the ideas that are circulating in the in the chat. It seems like America will go to some degree, to some extent, to do the right thing for food workers. And food work is 1 in 10 of the jobs in America, and yet 7 out of the 10 worst paying jobs are in the food system. And food insecurity is part of what it is to work in the food system, and that deep irony is often met by food banks. And so a question from one attendee is simply, why do we have food banks? Why do they exist? And why do we need to buy cans from the grocery store to give to food banks? Is this part of a broken food system?
It is certainly part of the broken food system. It is such evidence of, the abundance of this country, the fact that anyone goes hungry, that anyone is food insecure, is the deep, deep outrage that just drives me wild. And it is proof that we have to go to the fundamental economic driver of our brutal form of capitalism. I think most people are okay with the idea of a market. A market can be very effective, but it has to have rules, and every market has rules. And just when you were talking about food workers, I was just reading about how many protective regulations or standards, I would like to call them, that Trump removed in the food industry and put workers at incredible risk. And I haven't followed up to see how many of those have been reinstated, but that's just so basic of we have to have an accountable government to protect, to put in place the rules around what the market does so that it can protect certainly people who are in the meat factories and exposed to all sorts of people who are, it's just exposed to all sorts of chemicals and danger of injury. So it all really is about democracy. How do we get a democracy that is truly accountable to us and not to the agribusiness industry when they have, over 1,000 lobbyists there? So that is the general direction. And while I'm raving about democracy, I do want to mention more than once tonight that we collaborated with an organization whose organizations represent about 45 million Americans, and that's the Democracy Initiative. And we created a website. It's really simple to remember. It's just democracymovement.us, democracymovement.us. And there you can jump on and go to your state and see what's happening and see what the key issues are in the moment on national level of getting money out of politics, protecting voting rights, and ending gerrymandering and correcting gerrymandering, those basic things. So I just couldn't underscore more how, that we can walk on both feet, right? We can have our passion around food, as I do, and agriculture, as I do, and yet know that I've got to also keep my democracy ears open and be willing to step up. I marched 130 miles when I thought I couldn't walk 10 miles in 2016 as part of Democracy Spring, and that was life-changing. So anytime, I believe that, again, it's power, meaning, and connection. To be in any kind of mobilization like that, whatever opportunity you have for those, to really connect with other people in them and to do something you thought you couldn't do, I think it sort of makes you think, oh, well, then we can all do what we thought we couldn't do. So I consider that a real life-changing moment for me, that Democracy March. And then it's called Democracy Spring from Philly to Washington. And I'm not saying we created that, we who marched, but these years later, that what we were marching for is now part of the John Lewis voting rights. It's out there with the HR 1, S1, the For the People Act. And so, that you can feel that the energy is moving.
Can you perhaps just talk a little bit more about that? Because I know you've been part of the move to democratize America for a while. But I wonder if you've got a story from perhaps one of the readers of this fine book whose life you've changed and influenced. And how can readers take this book and use it as ammunition for their organizing beyond clicking on democracymovement.us?
Well, I think the best thing is for me, the returning to the book was just it reminds us that every single thing that we do, virtually all the choices we make, are sending out ripples. And the more that we align those, whatever aspect of whatever job you're in or whatever your pastimes, whatever you choose, you are sending out ripples. And so the only choice we don't have is whether to change the world, because every act is changing the world. So it's how do we do that? And so I just encourage, I think that when people tell me my book changed their lives, then you can imagine, how touched I am. And I don't always know exactly what they mean by that, of course. And I don't say, well, how did I do that? No, but I think what they're getting at is just the way it changed my life, maybe, that I really did believe that, yeah, that's right. The changes, the everyday changes we make, and starting with food is so personal that it touches us even deeper. It makes us healthier, for one thing, of choosing healthy food. So I would say that we all need buddies, though. And I would say if you're in a point, all of us tonight talking about all this, a place where you're uncertain, I think just one friend who is asking the same questions, you maybe read the same books and talk, okay, how can I make a difference? How can I feel that my voice is counting more powerfully? Because I want to feel that power, meaning, a connection, that what I began with. But I do think that we need others, and we need maybe even a really close buddy that we can talk to about our insecurities, about whatever it is we're trying to do. But and I know it's harder during COVID, but that I never like to prescribe for other people a particular angle into this feeling that we are together. Hans-Peter Doerr, a dear friend of mine in Germany, said to me, Frankie, in social and biological systems, there are no parts, there are only participants. And so that view that we're all together in this, and that sometimes we can feel so alone, but as we reach out and ask others in our circles, how could we find more meaning and feel more purposeful? I bet it's a lot more satisfying.
Well, with just a couple more minutes on the clock, while there is a question about Alan Savory and his claims of holistic management, I'll offer that to you. But if that's not something that you particularly want to engage with, there's also the other question, which is, as we sit around the table together, what should we be eating?
Oh, well, keep in mind that, as I said, that food system contributes 37% of greenhouse gas emissions. And I just learned from scholars who have studied this that if we eat in the plant world, we can reduce up to 2/3 or up to 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions from the food system by choosing plant foods instead of animal foods. And just to give you a sense of why that might be, currently we use about 80% of our agricultural land, including grazing, to produce livestock, but they give us back in calories, only 18% of our calories. So it's incredible amount of resources and waste and ecological destruction in the Amazon that I also read if we turn to a plant-centered diet, that we could save rainforest area that is equal half of the United States in area. Another estimate was that if we moved to plant-centered diets, we could, it would be like taking virtually all traffic off the roads, including planes and ships and all. So it's hugely significant to move to a plant-centered diet. And we now have, I could go on about the evidence for health, but there is tremendous evidence of greater longevity and particularly in cancer, lower cancer rates with a plant-centered diet.
Well, our table is set then, Frankie. We've got amazing reading. We've got fantastic company. We've got our friends and our buddies as we try and figure out how it is that we're going to make a change. And we know what we're going to eat too. So thank you so much, Frankie, for setting the table. I believe we're at time. And so I'm going to hand it over back to Bonnie and Anna. But thank you so much again, Frankie.
Thank you, Raj. Thank you, everybody tonight. Thank you, Bonnie and the bookstore. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you so much, Raj. And again, thank you everybody for coming. And I thought I would just drop another little mom wisdom morsel. Somebody in the chat was asking about lobbyists, and she makes the point in her new opening chapter that there are now, and you'll correct me, Mom, if I get this fact wrong, I think there are now over 20 mostly corporate lobbyists for every one member of Congress who you and I elect to serve in office. So she shares both the kind of depressing information like that, but also, as my mother always does in her work, is the sort of marrying of not shying away from telling us how bad things are, but always marrying that with the hope, the energy, the pathways to embracing our power and trying to make a difference. So I also feel like that's very much the spirit of Raj's work. And I put in the chat a link to get Raj's book Inflamed, to get the new Diet for a Small Planet. I'll give one more shout out to Raj's film, The Ants and the Grasshopper. You can go to antsandgrasshopper.org to find that. So, I just want to say to both you, Raj, and to you, Mom, I mean, two people who I continue to get such inspiration and such wisdom from, that, I think I speak for many of us to share that what a challenging time this is, the layers of crisis upon crisis, the pandemic that keeps us apart, where we have to gather on Zoom like this, the political crisis, the environmental crisis. And one of the things you've always taught me, Mom, is that in these moments of crisis, where we find hope is through engaging in community, is through taking action, is through feeling, again, as you said, like our life has meaning. And so I know when I sit with this book and commune with it, it's that kind of energy that I get from it. So with that, if you haven't already, please do get a copy of the books. Of course, thank you to independent bookstores everywhere, but specifically to Brookline Booksmith. It's been a real honor to work with you for this event. And if you feel so inspired, you can go to places that I will name here reluctantly, like Amazon or Goodreads, to drop reviews. You do not have to give them your money, but that does help people find the book and find Mom's work. We're really hoping that a whole new generation of people who've been awakened to the environmental crisis, awakened to the climate crisis, who are powerful activists in their own right, will discover this book. You can find out more about the book and other amazing partners, many of whom were on the line with us today at dietforsmallplanet.org. Again, congratulations, Mom. Thank you, Raj. One final shout out, because I know some of them were on the line, I saw their names, to the amazing chefs who contributed to this book. So some of our favorite chefs, including Alice Waters, who was on the line with us tonight, Jose Andres, Bryant Terry, Eileen Suzara, many incredible plant-centered chefs who really share our food values, contributed recipes. So they're in here in the new edition. And for the final word, I will turn it back to Frances Moore Lappé. Any final words of wisdom? And thanks again, Raj and Bonnie.
Well, I think I am just so delighted to share this message, and just so grateful to be able to talk about and share with you all what means so much to me in this journey of half a century. And Raj, I just so appreciate you and your work, and your questions were so strong. And I very, very grateful. And thank you, Bonnie and Brookline Booksmith. So it's a great store. Thank you all. And thank you all who are here with us tonight, figuring it out.
Beautiful. What a great note to end on. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to our audience, and we'll see you next time. Have a lovely evening. Good night.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.